welcome to Athens, welcome to the University of Georgia. And we're starting now. Sure. I'd like to briefly introduce you to my Dean Bo Rutledge, who knows many people and persistent supports clinics and experts here at law school. So without further ado, I'll leave it to you.
So thank you. I appreciate you all being here. This is my fourth year in the job, and I've come to conclude that part of the job description of the dean is to interrupt happy conversations and brush off the trouble. So I'm going to do both. And so I want to apologize in advance that I could not stay after these introductory remarks, not for lack of caring, but because of fire. Not literally. No, seriously, welcome.
You would tell us that.
I would, Chad. In all seriousness, I'd like to welcome you to Athens. I know those of you who traveled from the Northeast may have braved a little weather. Those of you who arrived between 3:30 and 6:30 last night may have braved a little traffic. You could not be here in a more beautiful winter, spring day in Athens. We're really excited to hear because what you all do very much embodies our mission. And our mission is very simple. It is to produce great ideas, to provide first-rate legal training, and to do so in service to state and society. And we capture that mission in sort of three words: prepare, connect, and lead. Prepare is evidenced by the fact that one of the things that I did when I became dean is to appoint an associate dean for clinical and experiential programs, because we recognized that experiential learning, whether through externships or clinics, was an essential part of preparing students for practice. That's in some ways nothing new. Since the 1960s, this School of Law has had an externship program for its students, when we began an externship program in prosecutors' offices. In 1997, we added a civil externship clinic, and today, at a time that many law schools are having to shutter or reconsider their programs, we here are fortunate to offer 16 and soon to be 17 different clinical and experiential programs, all of which are taking place under the leadership of my colleague and friend Alex Scherer. Is this part of the tradition of the conference that your presence just induces spontaneous applause?
He paid us.
And so this conference is obviously part of our commitment to that mission to prepare our students. The second part of that mission, connect. We often say here that we are the bridge builders between the dreams of our students and the realities of the profession. So the opportunity for our students to interact, frankly, with you during the time that you're here is a great opportunity, and also the opportunity for our clinical and experiential faculty to interact with you and bring back ideas that will represent the best practices of experiential learning, externships for years to come, helps us connect our students, your students, with the power that's brought together by bringing folks together. And finally, lead. We are a community of leaders, whether that is leadership in the bar, leadership in the judiciary, leadership in a community, or leadership at home. We're a firm believer that the opportunities that are created for students through externships and other experiential learning programs make them better lawyers and make them better citizens in our society. That's why we started this nation's first and until recently only clinic dedicated to representing victims of child sexual abuse. That's why we started the state's first live in-house program to provide services to veterans in Georgia, which had the highest per capita population of veterans of any state in the country, but no law school that was prepared to invest in a full-time director who would lead that clinic. Unless you've only applauded twice, as many of you know, the new director of that inaugural clinic is Alex Scherer. I've never seen you turn so red.
time.
And speaking of leaders, if you'll indulge me one more round of applause. As some of you may know, I had the privilege at the beginning of my career to work at a law school that was both dedicated to the externship program, and many of whose faculty were at the founding parents, if you will, of the externship program. Sandy Ogilvy and Leah Wortham, I know can't be here, but Sandy, if I could indulge you as a former colleague to stand and be recognized by you. I hope you enjoy your time here. I hope that this advances an understanding the importance of externships for experiential learning and the preparation for practice, and welcome to Externships Night. Thank you very much.
So I'm going to thank Dean Rutledge while he's on his way out of the room. I want to thank him for his enthusiastic support and especially his willingness to let us work our staff so hard. Looking out over this crowd, I am experiencing severe dislocation. The kind of out-of-context experience we've all encountered, right? So many old friends, new friends, soon-to-be friends here in my own space, mixing with my colleagues and co-workers. I hope you'll have time to explore campus in Athens, but if you've looked at the program, we're not actually giving you that. Apologize for that. I also hope you'll have a productive and a collaborative conference. This conference is one of my favorites. And there are many reasons for that, but one stands out. I know that I could talk with any person in this room, ask them what they do, tell them what I do, and we would look at each other as if we were from different planets. Right? The range and diversity of approaches to teaching externships is extraordinary. This conference can stretch you, give you fresh perspectives, introduce you to new practices, talk with each other, learn from each other, form new connections. All of this will help you and your students make the most out of your teaching. These conferences are also and always the work of many hands. And I have many people to acknowledge and thank. First, our excellent and hardworking planning executive. Not a single person in this group failed to bring their best to the process of building this conference, brick by brick, for 9 months since last week. So I'm going to call out your names and ask you to stand and stay standing, and ask you to withhold your applause. Everybody else, and then we can give them a shout out. So, Tim Floyd from Mercer. All right. Leslie Friedman from Denver. Carol Hayward from Cleveland Marshall. Bob Jones from Notre Dame, already standing. Carrie Kaas from Quinnipiac. Kendall Carruth from Georgia State. Lisa Mead from UCLA. Millicent Newhouse from Baltimore. Bridget Ortega from Atlanta's John Marshall. Esther Park from Washington. Meg Reuter from Missouri, Kansas City. Sue Schechter from Berkeley. And Sarah Schau from Emory. Please join me in applauding them. I also want to thank our hardworking staff. None of them are in the room to hear this, but I'm getting photographed while I say it. Lisa Mathis, who all of you should have met by now, our event coordinator, without whom I would be lost. Jim Hedberg, Brad Grove, and Carolyn Childers, our and now your tech support people. Rachel Evans, our web designer, Heidi Murphy, our publicist, designer of the program, and Sandy Ledford in our budget office, who has sent out bills to many of us. Finally, a few practical notes. First, Wi-Fi. You have a dedicated code to access Wi-Fi on the back of your name tag. If you are also a member of EduRoam, you can log in that way as well. Second, the lunch and town hall tomorrow are in Rust Hall, which is in this direction, next door on the 4th floor. All of the other events are in this building. All right? And the plenary session will be either in this room or the room right next door. Finally, a reminder about daylight savings time. The clock shifts on Sunday morning at 2 a.m. All I can say is, if you are looking for the hour of sleep that you lost, you're going to find them at my house, where I will be using each and every one of them next week. With that, I'll turn things over to Bob and Carrie to open our first plenary.
Do people have blue sheets? Yay! Okay. Where are the rest of our blue sheets? Top corner? Somebody just grab some and pass them around, please.
Okay, let's get underway. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Bob Jones with Carolyn. We have the honor and the pressure, honestly, of moderating the opening panel. So we need to get things off to a good start. As you know, our theme for the conference is coming of age. And we thought that in keeping with that theme, it would be appropriate to begin the conference by taking account of all the growth and development of externship programs in the 20 years since our first X1 conference. And in this plenary, we're going to begin by reviewing that development. And we're going to do it not just to say, pat ourselves on the back and say, job well done, although to some extent that sentiment is going to be appropriate. And it's important information, but rather we want to really spend some time and focus on how that development happened, why it happened, what forces have been at work that have influenced that development and are still at work, so that we can really think strategically about where we need to go from here. What are the challenges, what are the opportunities that lie ahead of us? And so we're going to ask our panelists to help us think about those opportunities and challenges for the community as a whole. We're going to invite you to think about challenges and opportunities, things you might want to accomplish in your individual programs, and hopefully with all that great thinking, we'll get things off to a roaring start.
So the contribution of Bob and me that was the biggest was recruiting these 5 wonderful people. And believe me, it was hard to cull from the group here and those of us who are not here to even just figure out who, there's a lot of people who could speak to this, but we're particularly proud that we got these 5 wonderful people to agree to take on this task. So let me first introduce a couple. I think you know them. We're not going to do their full bios, but we're really going to tell you, we asked them to look at the world of externships from certain perspectives, and this is, they have very different pathways to this chair right here. So Sandy Ogilvy first. He's the Director of Law and Social Justice Initiatives and Professor at Catholic University's Columbus School of Law. Why he's here, he, as many of you know, but perhaps some of you newer to our community don't yet know, he is really the historian of externships and of the clinical education, legal education more broadly. He has really helped to lay the foundation for our community, for the development of our pedagogy in so many ways. And just to name a few, he is one of the hosts of the Externships 1 conference at Catholic in not exactly as in date, but pretty much exactly, 20 years ago, 1998. I don't remember if it was March. March 5th, you're right. Woo-hoo!
Ask the historian.
Okay, yes, I knew he'd know. Creator of the original Lexstern website and co-author of our first and most important, up-to-date, externship textbook, Learning from Practice. I mean, I fondly would call it Ogilvy et al. So, all right, so that's a little bit of why we asked Sandy to be here, and he's going to speak first in a minute and talk about the history. Kate Kruse, Professor of Law at Mitchell Hamline. Kate brings multiple perspectives to our work. A long-time in-house clinician who's recently begun to teach externships. A clinical director, then associate dean, who's thought a lot about the role of experiential education, and in particular, therefore, externships, and acted in the Alliance for Experiential Learning. Cindy Batt. So we don't have little name tags, but if anyone knows, just raise your hand. Cindy has recently retired as Associate Professor and Director of Clinical Education at Stetson. She has really crossed over in another way. I see her successor sitting there smiling, going, oh. But she's still in Florida. She's still there. Anyway, she was hired as a lawyering skills and doctrinal teacher, then became the director of the entire clinical program at Temple, and then, which included teaching externships, and then eventually moving on to Stetson, where she closed out her professional career. She's co-chaired the externship committee, et cetera, co-author of the Externships chapter and building on best practices, and is currently working with many others in this room on a book on externship pedagogy and practice, lest she just decides she wants to spend all of her time with her grandson. No. But I'm going to turn it back to you for a minute to introduce our final two panelists.
Yeah, so some of you may be saying, enough of the seasoned veterans. What about the next generation? Who's going to speak for the up-and-coming externship clinicians? And our answer to that is Inga, Laurent, and Laurent Hughes. And we'd love to do fuller bios for our panel, but time prevents us from doing it. Inga is Associate Professor of Law and Director of the Externship Program at Gonzaga University School of Law. Carrie and I had a discussion about what verb to use to describe Inga's arrival on the scene, and we settled on that Inga burst onto the externship scene in 2010 and immediately became a very active member of the community. She's co-chaired the AALS clinical sections externship committee. She served on the CLIA externship committee. She spoke at a plenary at externship 6. So we're looking forward to her perspective. And Delora is Director of Externships at UC Irvine School of Law. She's another crossover to externship teaching. She was an in-house clinician and also Director of Clinical Education at Wayne State. So she has that broader perspective of running a both in-house and externship programs. And she's currently working on a book as well on externship pedagogy, the same one. So anyway, we're looking forward to her contribution as well. So
Now, we are ready to begin with our historical perspective. So we're going to lay the foundation by asking Sandy to lay the perspective of the historical aspect to our work. And we're going to just get out of the way. So Sandy Ogilvy.
Delighted to be here. I've been given about 15 minutes to do this, so this is more like a reduced Shakespeare version. I apologize that I don't have time to do it. But Laura has offered me for the chapter in her book for the history, and you can read all about it there.
And there are handouts in the back that have a little more information, including these slides.
All right, so I want to talk about essentially four aspects of the history of externships. One, the rise and the decline, and then the resurgence, if you will, of placements, in terms of numbers of programs and enrollments. I want to talk a little bit about externships in the broader clinical context, movement, ALS section here. I want to talk about the development of what I call the voice for externships in the 90s, some of the things that have gone on since then. I want to talk a little bit about the regulation of externships. So, in the founding, at the time of the founding of this country, there were 12 of the 13 states required apprenticeships in order to become a member of the faculty. However, by 1860, only about 9 of 39 jurisdictions did so. As part of the Jacksonian democracy, where the elites were not well regarded. Anybody then could become a lawyer, all you had to do was show up. After the Civil War, there was a push by their leading members of the bar to raise the standards for admission for profession. And this led to the founding of the ABA in 1878, and it immediately formed a committee on the admissions, education admissions for the bar. The bar leadership was fighting for a generalized requirement of apprenticeship, part of which could be served in law school, and in effect a bar examination. And so, under this leadership, by 1890, 23 of 39 jurisdictions required a formal period of study or apprenticeship. ALS was founded in 1900. The ALS and the ABA then began a push to get rid of apprenticeships and make sure that everyone went to law school. And so by the 1920s, nearly every new lawyer in this country had training almost exclusively in law schools. Nevertheless, in the late 20s and early 30s, there was again some pushback attempting to redress the imbalance that has been established between the academic and the practical, with a handful of schools incorporating legal aid work into their programs, usually with cooperation with local legal aid societies. Even so, by the late 1950s, only about 25 schools offered clinics based on this was to change beginning in 1959, when the NLABA convinced the Ford Foundation to fund externships to place students in legal aid society offices around the country. The Ford Foundation authorized $500,000 in grant money to 19 schools. Second round of grants from 1965 to 1968 added 21 more schools. Half of these were for summer internships. Then in 1968, Ford funded the Council on Legal Education Responsibility, CLEPR, which operated from 68 to 80, with about $10 million in grants. CLEPR's emphasis really was to try and encourage in-house clinics through its grant making, but couldn't get all the schools to go along with that, and so also funded externship programs. And so, as a result, by the first 2 years of the CLEPR funding, programs grew from 25 to 80. By 1979, CLEPR estimated that fully 90% of the law schools in the country had some form of clinical education, either in-house, farm out, or in some cases, just simulation. As CLEPR was winding down, the federal government stepped in to encourage the creation of clinics, principally in-house clinics. Between 1978 and 1997, the Department of Education Law School Clinical Experience Program made grants of about $87 million to law schools. Despite the funding emphasis on in-house clinics, externship programs were also being developed, so that by 1986, nearly every law school had an externship course, and the number of students enrolled was roughly equivalent to that of in-house placements. Now, with respect to externships in the broader community of clinical education, we see that the ALS section on the clinical education was established in 1973. It was relatively inactive until 1977, and that was the time of the first ALS clinical conference, which, as you know, have continued on a yearly basis since then. A seminal event occurred in October of 1979 when Klepper sponsored a conference at Phoenix in Florida. And as it was going out of business, the commissions in attendance at the conference saw the handwriting on the wall that unless they organized, they were just losing all the gains that clinical education had made up to that point in time. And so they formed the Key History Group and the so-called Gang of Eight, essentially to lobby the ALS, the ABA, schools to keep clinics alive and growing. What they meant by clinics was principally in-house clinics. The section didn't have an externship committee until 1987. As you know, CLIA was founded in 1991. It didn't have an externship committee until 2011, again, at the end of this year. Until the 90s, externship programs were a very small part of the larger discussion at clinical conferences. Then, externship faculty and directors began to organize, and things started to change. CLIA sponsored probably the first large externship conference in 1993, which was an add-on to the LS clinical conference in Virginia. GLACE, the Greater Los Angeles Consortium of Externships, was founded that same year. 1995, we got the Cochrane published Traditional Externships, a clinic inside the courtroom, and numerous articles about externships began to be published in big numbers. In your handout toward the end of it is a chart showing really jump in publications. The first large-scale standalone externship conference was held, as Al said, at Catholic in 1998. We also published the externship text that year. In 1999, I established the Lexington listserv, and people really started talking to each other. 5 years later, in 2003, we did the second externship conference, and then 3 years later, the third, Carolyn, Western, Los Angeles, and then every 2 years since then, so we're now at externships 9, 20 years on. The conferences, the listserv, the websites, the books and articles have raised the profile of externships in the larger clinical community, and I think it's spurred the development of stronger programs throughout. The last thing I really want to talk about is briefly the regulation of clinical education, and more specifically the regulation of externships, because they were the only ones that really were regulated. In 1973, the ABA standards for the first time mentioned clinical work and studies away from the law school. Nothing really happened. 1986, they added specific criteria for externships in Interpretation 2 of Standard 306. In 1993, that interpretation was amended to list 9 factors that the commission teams should look at when reviewing externships and impose 6 requirements. In 1999, most of the interpretation moved into the actual text of the standard 305. Things remained roughly the same until 2004, when they started cranking out a little bit more, requiring site visits if fieldwork credits exceeded 6, 2005, periodic on-site visits or their equivalent, if fieldwork credits exceeded 3. And then in 2014, requiring contemporaneous opportunity for reflection if the student could earn more than 2 credits. All these things aimed solely at externships rather than clinical programs. As you know, 2016, complete rewrite of the standards, although in section 304, there's still an extensive section that's not specific about externships. We thought it would be interesting to pull together a few more slides in the limited time that I have to show some of the historical data about several topics, some of which seem to have been of special interest to the ADA standards providers. Those seem to be concerned about site visits, training of supervisors, fieldwork supervisors, high credit programs, classroom components, and the evaluation of externships. And then the final slide in my section is to put together the data on the status of persons involved in externship programs. So we'll just run through a couple of these pretty quickly. So you can see here, the top line is upper level enrollment. It is the total number of students eligible for the in-house externships. And the bottom line, yellow, is the in-house positions that are available, and the green line of externship placement positions that are actually filled. That's pretty standard numbers. Site visits. The APA was concerned that not enough people were doing site visits. Well, look at that chart. In 1982, over 30% of the programs were doing them, and going up to nearly 70% now. Didn't seem to be practically made. Training on-site supervisors. Again, in 3, not many people were doing it. Today, nearly 70% of the programs are doing some form of training on-site supervisors. This one's hard to read. This is courses by number of credits awarded. At the top one is a range of courses. The way that the data is collected, it makes it impossible really to do good comparisons here. So I can't. But if you just look at the percentages overall, they stay relatively stable throughout. Even the high credit programs, 10 and now 15% of the total programs. So here's the percentage of courses with 6 more credits. Not a big change. Percentage of courses with a classroom component. Again, ABA was seen to be concerned that that was not happening. And at least from the late 90s, it was in a large. This one just shows the grading of externships. Again, the top line is fieldwork is graded on a pass-fail basis. Blue line, classroom component, over 50% of those are the equal number status of faculty. Again, hard to do comparisons because of the way that the data is collected. But again, relatively stable. There is some drop-off from the early years, obviously, of tenure track positions, and an increase of long-term contract positions, and certainly an introduction of clinical tenure into as well. But for adjuncts used to rule the roost in terms of there seems to be less use today. I want to encourage you when the CSAIL survey comes out to fill it out because the best data I have is from 2007 when I did my last survey, and we had about 180 schools respond. The recent CSAIL data isn't anywhere close to that. And it really will help you help yourselves respond to that and get those data. Thank you.
Thank you, Sandy. A lot of food for thought. It will take us all a while to digest those numbers. But they obviously show a lot of growth, a lot of development over time. And the question is, why? Why did that happen? What forces have been pushing this and influencing it? And we want to ask each of our panelists to take a stab at that. And I want to begin, I think, with Cindy.
Let's talk about money. I think one of the really crucial forces has been the economy. And there were ups and downs before the Great Recession of 2007-8. It's hard to believe it's been 10 years, and in part it's difficult to believe that it's been 10 years for those of us working in legal education, because I'm not sure it's ended. Other parts of the economy may have recovered, but many of the forces that we started to see back then are still in operation. We're still dealing with it. So if we can do a little flashback, we know that at that time, both legal practice was deeply affected. Jobs were lost, law firms had fewer clients, they had less money, they had less resources. Even those people that retained their jobs had less mobility, which of course meant that there were fewer jobs for new graduates. And the effect on the law schools started to multiply. So we had students coming in with increasing debt. We still see that. There were fewer jobs for them to go to, not only post-graduation, but during the law school, which meant that they were less well-trained at a time when the bar was looking for graduates that were better trained because they no longer had the time and resources to do that. In addition, there was fewer money coming in for development. Law schools were being, fewer people were going to law school. So law schools were caught in this enormous crunch with higher demands from their students for better training, more jobs, development issues, career development issues from lots of offices. So it's not surprising with pressure from the bar, pressure from judges, pressure from students, law schools started to look within to see how they could deal with that. And who became the first responders in this crisis? Externships. And we did respond. And our ability to be flexible, to assist, to provide training, was both a boon to the law schools and to the bar, and also enormously challenging, because we had expectations placed on us for scrutiny far beyond what we had had previously. Not only had we been invisible and in the basement, we weren't even in school as far as many of our colleagues perceived us. And suddenly we were expected to provide networking, to provide skills training, to provide introductions to practice, to provide practitioners with a semester-long tryout by which they could evaluate students as prospective employees, and we had to respond to that.
Oh, no,
Do
you
I have
got,
the
you
1
got a
minute?
minute left. No.
I
I failed to properly program my iPhone, sorry. That was an alarm for something else.
So, the good part of this is is that our ability to respond, our ability to be, to provide assistance for students, the school, and the bar, enhanced our visibility in our groups. And we started to become part of the group. So, and none of that has really gone away, at least as far as I can see. And
That's an even better one.
I brought my child to conferences.
Thank you, Cindy. Inga, what do you see at work?
All right.
Follow
That's
that
your
up.
best intro ever. Right? That is the best intro ever. Thank you. All right. So I wrote down, I have way too much. It's way too much. So I'm just going to go. Y'all can stop me when my time is up. So, all right, just to frame us, in 2007, I'm talking about professional identity. In 2007, the Carnegie report came out saying that and issuing some pretty strong statements, saying the profession of law is fundamental to flourishing of American democracy, but our profession is suffering from varying degrees of confusion and demoralization. A reawakening of the profession is necessary. And I would argue that we will only see this reawakening in legal education if we, legal educators, bring it about, right? As we train lawyers, so they become, right? And that's really the only way, I think, to see our profession shift as a whole. So I would also argue that because of our proximity to the profession, that we are uniquely situated in externships to bridge both of those worlds, and that we are absolutely the people in the law school who are in the best position, and that we're vital to law schools and to the profession. And so we're the ones who are actually both having the benefit and the challenge of being that reawakening. I know it's a pretty bold statement, but I was tasked to be the zealot of this. And this is not a stretch, because I've drank the Kool-Aid a long time ago. So I'm going to flesh out a little bit about the why on this, and why I believe this, and how we can do this a little bit later when we do our deeper dives. But for this segment, my task is to focus on the question of professional identity and how it shaped our work. And some, you've already heard from Sandy, but every major report, the Craig Carnegie best practices, which I'll talk about a little bit more in depth, seem to basically conclude that professional identity is something that can really only be forged in the fires of practical experience. It's when you experiment with the theoretical that you actually start to develop that authentic identity of how you're going to walk in your professional way. But as we all know, since the inception of the academy, there's been a resistance to that notion, creating that divide that we all know pretty well, right? This fundamental tension of theory versus practice. And that's definitely not something that's going away anytime soon. Now, this actually makes sense if you put it in context. As Sandy said, prior to the 1870s, training was pretty sporadic, right? It was done under the apprenticeship model, and what that meant was, you know, you kind of got what you got, right, according to supervision, and there wasn't any regulation, right? So at least now we have regulation around these perimeters, but then there wasn't, and so the quality really depended on the quality of supervision that you got. And so Christopher Columbus Langdell, we all know him, he discovered, right, the case law teaching model, or he's said to have discovered. Peter Joy, by the way, does a fantastic job in The Uneasy History of Experiential Education, which is a forthcoming publication, in laying all of this history out. And this is where I get a lot of it from, so if you're interested. So, like we said, Langdell was actually, I think, correct in many ways. We needed some consistency, we needed some rigor in how we actually applied legal education. So I have no complaint with that. But I think what happened is they went a little overboard, right? They overcorrected, because in order to form a new model of legal education, what they did was devalue the education that was already in existence, which was experiential education. And so therein lies that tension that we've had ever since, right? That core, it's the devaluing of one over the other. And I think that our job is to figure out how to really bring those together, how to integrate those two models. So it's not an either or, and so neither side is overcorrecting, because you need both pieces. So, like I said, in the context, it made sense. And he was fighting an uphill battle. Now the sands have shifted. The case method has been the dominant method of legal education, which means now we are fighting an uphill battle as clinicians. And so I think that the recognition that experiential learning was essential to practice has never really gone away. So there's been resistance ever since the academy started. In fact, in 1909, there was a member of the bar who said, "I think a grievous error has been made in allowing students to take the bar exam without serving time in some clerkship." Right? And then in 73, there was Chief Justice Berger basically said the medical profession does not try to teach surgery simply with books. So there have been rumblings, thank you Alex, throughout time, but throughout the time that legal education was formed, but they haven't necessarily been formalized. What happened then, starting about the 90s, was a slew of formalization in reports coming back saying we need more experiential education, we are having a gap in between practice and the profession. And so what you saw was the McCrate report came out in 1992, that was Bob McCrate, super big report, super important, look it up if you haven't seen it, and 14 deans, by the way, signed on a letter saying that the McCrate report, I just have to say this because it's funny, 14 deans signed on against urging the McCrate report recommendations, saying that they were being used, the ABA was using them to push skills and clinical education. So I say externships are like crack. So if you remember anything from my plenary, remember that. And I'm out of time.
Wow. Kate.
Wow, hard to follow
Yeah.
that.
Yeah, we're going to take.
Well, I'm talking about ABA regulations and also the experiential education movement, and I'm going to kind of do that in reverse order, and kind of following up from what Inga said. When I started as a clinical professor in 1990, people didn't really talk about experiential education. They talked about clinics and clinical education. And kind of what Sandy's history, demonstrated, there was a lot more organization among in-house clinicians, and there was this general feel in the community that the in-house clinic was sort of the gold standard, and it was the real way that students would learn how to be lawyers. And there were these certain, sort of clinicians who were in this other, lesser kind of teaching called externships, and they would come to clinical conferences, but it was harder for them to connect with the, what was being said at clinical conferences because the pedagogy didn't really match what they were doing, and clinicians kind of looked down on the pedagogy and said, well, I don't really approve of that. And there were some schools, very highly respected leading clinicians who really took the position that externships were inferior, if not dangerous. So I think what I've seen over the couple decades that I've been involved is that there really has been a shift in, I would say, the last 10 years to view clinical education or in-house clinics, field placements, and simulations as a three-legged stool. And this has been the new rhetoric, and it's been shared in best practices volumes. It's been shared by the glossary for political legal education, experiential education. It's been shared, and it's now reflected in the ABA's regulations, and that they now, have a single standard that divides the language experiential courses, and then dividing those experiential courses into clinics, field placements, and simulation courses. And I think there's a growing understanding and at least lip service to the idea that these three forms of experiential pedagogy are not the same, they're not interchangeable, and they each have their own benefit. And that it is best when students have exposure to all three, because there are different things that you can teach within each. And that's a change, and I feel like it's a change in sort of the status of externships as one leg of the stool, as opposed to the inferior kind of form of clinical education that's the sort of unwanted stepchild sort of thing. So I think I see it reflected in the ABA, right? I don't think that that's an accident. I I know that's not an accident, because I was involved in CLIA during the time those changes were made, and I know that my own experience was from being, I think it was when I was the vice president of CLIA, kind of coming up into the president's role, when CLIA was issued, during this whole comprehensive review of the standards, CLIA issued a statement that I had a hand in actually offering that was viewed by the externship community within the clinical community as highly disrespectful of externships. And it was completely unconscious, on certainly my part, and probably the part of the other people who were on the executive committee of CLIA, none of whom were externship professors. So I know that I went to the working group at the AALS clinical conference that was externship working group, and Harry was there with a clipboard.
I still have it.
We need to talk about this CLIA statement. I was like, yeah. And I was like, am I going to admit that I was the one who wrote it? But I put my head down and was like, I want to learn. I want to learn what I did wrong. And Cindy got involved. I got Cindy involved in CLIA, and Beth, and Beth Schwartz, and really. I feel like there was more energy around including the externship committee in the drafting of CLIA statements, and therefore in the influencing of the ABA standards. And so I think there were people in this room that organized strongly to push this and make it happen. So they know who they are, and I know who they are. I mentioned 3 of them. I maybe missing others, but
She shared her Kool-Aid with you.
There was much Kool-Aid shared and gratefully accepted.
Thank you for your open-mindedness, Kate. Delora, what do you see at work?
So I've been tasked. First, I just want to say I'm just absolutely privileged to sit at not to not look at Inga in this moment, but we're absolutely privileged to sit at this table and to look at this history and see how much has happened even just in the 2000s, right? How new a lot of this is. And there are moments, I think, especially as a person who transitioned from in-house clinical teaching to externships, where I feel really behind. And then I'm catching up to learn all of the things that have happened. And then I look at the timeline and realize that there's also so much in just this last little bit that I've had a privilege to be even just a little small part of. So unlike the zealot to my left, I got tasked with the yes but. So sort of the, as we're going to call it, the Delora Downers of which I hope is not indicative of anything about me necessarily. It's just what got left over. Is that we've come really far, and there has been so many amazing and wonderful things, and we are now in the spotlight. Maybe we're still in the basement, but people are paying attention, and they know that we're down there. Maybe that was progress. Maybe they turned the lights on. Good things have happened, but just to kind of run through just a little bit about what the forces are, some of the forces that might actually be holding us back, or things that we need to be thinking about in moving into this next part of our timeline and our lifespan. So a little bit of that, I think Kate touched on definitely with this new push in terms of talking about experiential education. And that shift from clinical ed to experiential ed kind of happened without, I think, a lot of folks really spending time thinking about what that might actually mean. We have 3 parts, but what does that mean in terms of all of us coming together? Those 3 parts are not necessarily treated equally. I think Kate mentioned the sort of golden standard piece when it comes to in-house clinics, and it's been particularly interesting for me, I think, making that transition to see how I'm responded to from an old role into this new role, and at a couple of different schools at that. I like to move around a lot just to keep you people paying attention, and so that the name tags are never clear. I assume that's part of why there's no school here, is that we just couldn't possibly keep up with it. Yeah, there's too many places. But a little bit of that is thinking about one of those forces. How do we fit into that grand scheme? How do we collaborate with our in-house clinical brethren, making sure that anything that brings us up is not met with the fear that we are bringing anyone else down. Right? Does that make sense? And so that there is an understanding of that sort of 3-legged stool of what those parts actually are, how they all work together, and the value, the separate and different value that each of those bring. to legal education. That they don't have to be the same, they can be related, but that each student may come to them differently and they all have different purposes. To the money piece, so if we want to, let's talk about money for a second. So I don't know, you got to do that when you talk about money. You guys talk about money. But there is an impact and a force that we have to think through about that impact of us being cheaper, right? Or viewed potentially as being cheaper. Whether that should be true, is true and or should be true is like a whole different deep dive discussion, right? That we can get into. But maybe to some degree because we are cheaper, arguably cheaper, how that allows us to be viewed as lesser, right? You get what you pay for, right? And then also that inexpensive legal help. That we can be viewed as a substitute for firms can't hire, can't train, whatever. Well, we'll just grab those kids from the law school, right? I think the judiciary is a great example of let's run more efficiently by utilizing the brilliant young minds that are down the road at the law school. One piece to be slightly less of a downer, but more of something for us to work towards, we had our scholarship workshop this morning, building our scholarship and our pedagogy up in the same way and following that. All right, I can speak much more quickly, but I don't think it's going to do anybody any good. Building our scholarship and our pedagogy up in the same way that the in-house clinical community has done to validate not only what we're doing, but how we're doing it, which leads to me to the last force that I want to talk about, and it's really the role confusion piece. Who are we? We're in career services office, we're in admissions offices, we're kind of all over the building. Some of us are in within our clinical faculty. Some of us are just like maybe still in the basement in the building next door, we're unclear. But that role confusion, and specifically I think that for us, that one thing we want to emphasize out to the world is that at its heart, regardless of what department you put us in, that we teach courses and that we are teachers that use pedagogy, connect our own pedagogy as well as that connected to in-house clinician or clinical focus to do what we do and that it's valuable. So to me, just the quick sum of forces to work on. I think now what we are going to do is actually kick it out to
We're going to have a chance to dig into these topics a little more in a minute with our panelists.
Yeah. So we wanted to get what we thought about into the room, into the ether. What we're going to do is we're almost at the halfway point, so we thought it would be fun. This was Bob's idea, that everyone can stand up, stretch, find 2 or 3 people near you. Don't move too much, but stand up, stand up. And you don't like move around the room, but find 2 or 3 people next to you. What else do you see? What have we missed? Or do you want to say what's most important? Talk to each other 2 minutes. shout out, something new, something they want to affirm. Does any of the small groups want to add anything to our discussion for 1 minute? Yes, Susan?
Paid externships?
Yes, so one of the evolutions. So that is a new development and changing seasons. Anything else that you want to put on? What else? Yeah, you are here. Why did someone say you weren't?
I think one of the things that happened is that we developed a lot of pedagogy separate from in-house clinic that is now part of the in-house clinic movement as well. A lot of work on professional identity, a lot of work on things. And I think part of it is because at the beginning there was a point at which, I think it was a good step to sometimes say, look, you like it, you don't like it. I mean, we're just gonna do what we do, okay? And let's have our own conferences and, and a lot of things sort of seeped in. And I think also we have, in-house clinics, we're crazy busy, but we have the advantage of being one step removed. We don't have a day-to-day responsibility for supervising students ourselves. We don't have to be responsible for clients. When we look at supervision, when we look at lawyering, we're not looking at our own supervision, which gives you a little bit of distance. And I think those are just some advantages, or differences at least that have allowed us to have the time and space to develop some pedagogical things, which I think are now part of general clinical thinking.
Great, so we're about to go into a deeper dive, but one quick statement.
I think that the difference between externships and clinics is melding a little bit. I think there's more hybrid, I think there's more packaging, I think there's more things that are going on. So I think that some of the things that are developing are kind of starting to be woven together, right, really thoughtfully more than they were in the past.
Okay, so.
One more.
What, one more?
Just in line with that though, we have a lot more constituencies to deal with. We have the students, the site, and the faculty, so we have to balance all of the, so just that as well.
All right, so actually, you can take those comments into the discussions where we've picked 4, and I think a lot of what was just said can be brought in, and a couple people are going to take what we've been calling euphemistically the deeper dive. So I know we have talked about regulation, but I want to give Sandy, Kate, and Cindy a couple minutes each, or however you want to do it, to what else do you want to say about the role of regulation, particularly the ABA?
You gotta speak loud.
Okay. Well, I already said something about regulation, how I think it's getting better in terms of externships. I just want to say what I think. I think paid externships was a battle we lost. The externship community as a whole opposed it, and the ABA went ahead with significant pressure from the young lawyers division. But I do think that the next frontier that I hope we cross is removing externships from the category with moot court and law review as a co-curricular activity. I think now that externships are defined as experiential courses, as long as they meet the requirements, I think they should be defined as regularly scheduled classroom credits. And I hope that we accomplish that. That's
Sandy.
I guess I'm a little concerned, and I'd be interested in people's reactions to this, to the placement of externships in the new regulations, which still seems to more highly credit those courses, in-house clinics, simulations, where there is repeated opportunities for performance, supervised and evaluated by a faculty member. I see that as a real, especially if requirements for experiential credits go up from, say, 6 to 8 or 15, that externships, as they are practiced in most schools, will be pushed out altogether.
How, can you say a little more about that? That got murderous. How do you see the same as he pushed back given some of the forces? So say a little more about that, please, before people walk out the room.
Again, every school's different. Every school has the needs. Speaking for my school, we've had a little retrenchment on bar pass programs. And so that means more required courses. And more required courses means fewer opportunities for any sort of experiential education. To the extent that the California bar, New York bar, other bars start ratcheting up the requirements for experiential education, and those don't include externships, but take on the definition of the 303 standard. I see that externships may be pushed out as well.
Cindy, we do have a little more time.
Okay.
What do you want to
I'll
add to this?
And I'll take it. I think that both Sandy and Kate have highlighted the fact that although we have moved into what I have called a new neighborhood by being moved from 305 to 304, we are still being treated as the simple child that needs lots of regulation. So there is extra regulation in 304C, and we also have this issue where our hours are not counted in the same way as clinics and to some extent the extra work that goes into preparing for skills courses. So those are issues that do need to be addressed because they affect the enrollment of students in externships in schools where we have lots of competition. So I think those are both they represent both a success in that we are in 304 and a part of the curriculum, and it's also the dangers of overregulation, which we've dealt with.
To what extent, though, do you see some of those as holding schools' feet to the fire rather than holding externship teachers? You know, in other words, sometimes giving us opportunity and power to push back and say, you have to let me do my job right. Do you see any positives in that?
Absolutely. Okay, I think that, and this is part of my deeper dive into mission, but we are a part of the curriculum, at least as far as the ABA is concerned, and our mission is defined in the same way as any other course within the curriculum. However, the amount of administrative checks completely overwhelms the externship teacher. And that's not, that may be holding the school's feet to the fire, but in fact, we're responsible for making sure that the school doesn't get burned. And there's no way around it.
All right, so we will continue this discussion now. Laurent and Kate are gonna speak. I don't care who goes first. Let's go back to the idea of how much we've been working on theorizing our pedagogy, both in writing and conferences, etc. Do you care which one starts?
Yeah, I was going to start. I think I was involved, and so this was before my time as a clinical professor, but I was involved in a symposium that was celebrating the 25th anniversary of the publication of the Bellow and Moulton book, The Lawyering Process, which, and I learned through that those materials, when they were produced in the late 1970s, really helped to start coalescing the pedagogy of clinics. That there were clinical professors and all these in-house clinic professors in all these schools teaching, and they were sharing materials, and that having these teaching materials really pulled together and started to define what that pedagogy was. And then there were a series of symposia in different law reviews would host symposia on clinical pedagogy, and people were writing law review articles on in-house clinic pedagogy, and it just became more of a way of standardizing and theorizing what that pedagogy was. And I see that happening in the externship movement only like 20 years later. Like 20 years later, that's, you know, that same kind of coalescing and developing and refining of the pedagogy through scholarship began happening in externship pedagogy, and I think we're in the process of it now. I think this is my third externship conference. What I love about these conferences, first of all, everyone sends out surveys, like in advance of the conference, like how do you do this and how do you do that, and I think there's just this wide range, like Alex said in his introduction, this wide range of practice in terms of the way people teach, and it's under-theorized. You know, I see it all as under-theorized opportunities to be sharing ideas and thinking about, you know, what are the benefits of allowing students to choose their own placements versus having placements set up for them. Do we like private placements, or do we think externships should be public interest? You know, I think these are all like sort of debates. I don't want to say they're contentious debates, but they're pedagogical, interesting exchanges of ideas, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for a lot more of those exchanges of ideas to be happening in writing, in some of the pedagogical literature, and I think when you do that, when you engage in it, it helps you think through what you're doing, why you're doing it. It helps the community advance those discussions and deepen its understanding of pedagogy, and I think there's just a lot. We're in some ways, in-house clinic pedagogy is, you know, tapped out in a way. Like there's a lot of things have been fully aired, and I feel like externship pedagogy is still youthful, and there's a lot of opportunity to grow.
And I think one of the things we were talking about, I think Carrie hit on this a bit, is to some degree, depending on how you view that extra level regulation. So we view it to some degree as we are taking this seriously, right? This is a big deal. We want to hold schools to the feet to the fire to do it well. Having these pedagogical discussions, right, this is a response to that, to demonstrate, having those discussions not just here at this conference, but putting it out there in the world to demonstrate how deeply everybody in this room and tons of other folks are thinking about what we do and working on those issues and building on that in-house clinical pedagogy, right, and that scholarship, taking that and transforming it. I mean, so one of the things for me in my perspective of transitioning from in-house to this is when I started looking for things, I guess I'm going to admit to, when I first started, I thought, oh, well, I'm teaching a criminal externship course. I've been teaching criminal justice clinics for years. I'll just pick that right up and move it over here, and that didn't work at all. There's a lot of nodding happening for people who apparently attempted that as well. Yeah, mission fail. And so I started, you know, it sends you back out into the world to look for that scholarship, to find out what is out there, what are the resources that you can utilize. And I realized it taught me how many holes there are. It's not that it's not happening and that we're not thinking about it and that folks aren't talking about it, doing all that, but we have to put it down and we have to put it in paper and we've got to put it out into the world for it to be discussed, to help validate, I think, for others, to validate ourselves, and also for folks to realize that just because that regulation exists doesn't make us just administrators, right? To demonstrate the teaching side of what we're doing in both how we're building on the in-house piece, but also how we're different.
Anything else you want to add to that? Anybody? You good?
She just gave me an amen.
No,
I think I'll be back.
we're good.
All right.
Sell it over here.
So, okay, the mission of externships in the curriculum. That pulls together a couple of strands. And that's Cindy and Inga are going to speak about that.
Okay, I talked about the fact that we all share the same objective of legal education. If we didn't know it before, the ABA defined it for us. We want students to pass the bar, and we want students to emerge from law school ready to be responsible, effective, ethical practitioners. However, the chameleon-like quality of externships allows us to pick and choose and be intentional. It also places the burden on us that we've talked about, where people want us to be all things to all people and all needs. And sometimes they expect us to do that without very many resources. So once again, I'm talking about money.
There's laughter in the room.
Yeah, so we need to be really intentional as to how we break down that big objective and what we choose to do. Traditionally, externships have been sequenced to be in the last part of law school, maybe sometime during the last 3 semesters or the last 2 semesters. And it was almost literally a conveyance of students from the law school to the world of practice. By exposure, by supervision, and increasingly by the intentional focus of externship teachers on certain aspects of both lawyering skills and lawyering qualities that are important to any lawyer's success and also in service of the clients that they will eventually have. More and more, we're looking at a broadening of our objective and goals and more distinctions. So there are 2 questions. One is, how does each externship teacher determine objectives? And secondly, how does each school sequence externships so as to be most effective? I believe that our real value is in bringing a practice context to every level of legal education by infusing every year of law school with some sort of in-practice externship. I don't see that happening a lot, but I do see it happening more and more. And I'm turning this over to Inga.
All right, thank you. It's a lot to think about. I just want to say here, think, not respond. All right. So I think it's our job as externship professionals to ask why. Right, those are the big questions in life. Why are we here? And so I think of us as the 3-year-old child constantly asking why. Whether that's in our students, asking our students to investigate themselves and ask them why, or to ask our systems why they are doing the things they are doing and functioning in the roles that they're functioning. And that's so unique. We're the only people in the school who get to be at that point of contact, and that's really cool. So students, it's our job to force students into that self-examination space. So I think one of the things that troubled me a lot when I started working in externships is I'm a codependent, right? I want to fix everything. And so my students and the profession can be a mess sometimes. And the reality, that is how it is. And I was trying to fix it, right? I was trying to make it so my students didn't have a hard time. What I realized as I've learned and grown in this profession, in my role, is that I actually have a very different role than I envisioned in the first place. My job and the tripartite relationship, that distance that we have, actually enables us to really walk with students in a very different way. So I think that instead of tightly controlling everything in the classroom, my job now is to help students inhabit a more authentic space. And what we can do as teachers in externship programs is model that flexibility, that collaborative or that indigenous learning that happens when students transfer their own learning and their own information with one another. We model adaptability because we have no idea what class content is going to be, because our class content is what's actually happening in the field. We have no way to prepare for that. But we know as lawyers, just like our students have no way to prepare for what's going to come in the door when they face a client. We have processes, we have frameworks, and that's our job. Our job is to model those behaviors for our students so so that they can enter into that space confidently, or at least a little more confidently than where they are. Because we know when they start in their externships, right, the confidence is like down, and they see themselves as a burden, and that needs to shift. Because what we're doing is we are actually valuing the profession. I think that's something that gets missed all the time. What we're asking supervisors to do is to constantly, we're asking our students to critique our institutions. We're the repository for all of the problems going on in the legal field. Like, we have so much knowledge and so much information, it's quite amazing. And we force our students to force our supervisors to use reflective processes. It's amazing. We're getting in there, we're changing the profession by having our students constantly asking our supervisors why. Why did you decide your case that way? And so what the supervisor has to do is move from tacit knowledge, which they've had for all of their life, because that's the process that they've been using, right, into expressly explaining why they're choosing to utilize certain functions and why they're making certain decisions that way. And it's a confrontation that, frankly, I think scares a lot of people, because it's real space, that's authentic space, and it's something only we can do. And it's really, I think it's a really cool job we have.
We do indeed. Thank you. The Kool-Aid will be available on the break. Laura, did you want to say something else, or are you ready to move on?
No, I think well, we're, Inga and I are tasked with the next section, which is the who are we. I think what she just hit on is the part that we also don't want to skip, is the social justice roots of what we're doing. I think, who are you again? You're Cindy. And, let me see that name tag. And at the beginning, talking about us, describing us as first responders, right? At the beginning that there are problems, there's problems in the fields, there's issues in the field, there are issues going on, and I think Inga hit the nail on the head, which is that we are that repository, and that's the one question that got posed when we started talking about this was, what's changed in that social justice root, in the social justice roots, what's changed in terms of us meeting that as a part of our mission? And I think that's the key, is that we are no longer just those first responders, we are the repository for the problems and the issues, and that leads us to being the people who can best, to some degree, write about those issues, put that out, do some of the training, but also model all of those behaviors for our students at the same time.
Before Sandy, you wanted to say something, so we're trying to be a little nimble, flexible, and improv here. Right ahead.
Yeah, I think this touches on this social justice mission a little bit. As I kind of ride into the sunset of my career in legal education, I regret personally.
Can you speak up a little more?
I can try. I regret personally not having done more to increase access to justice in this country. If you look back historically, the numbers of people without adequate abilities for representation has not increased one whit since the early 1800s. And I take personal responsibility for that. But I also take responsibility for as a legal educator. And I think that we, in all aspects of our law schools, need to come to grips with that and do something about it. I'm not sure how the externship community specifically does that, but I'd like to leave you with that challenge to move that part of our mission.
Great. All right, so let's wrap up for a few minutes before we have one more interactive piece on the who are we, and Laura and Inga are going to take us home on that. And we've, again, foreshadowed a lot of what they're going to go a little deeper in.
So one of the things we identified in thinking about who we are, and we've touched on lots of different pieces of that, is this tension and contradiction between our courses and our programs being more appreciated than our teachers. So each of you is maybe individually feeling a little less than sometimes, while at the same time the pressure is on to add more things, do more stuff, bring in more students, add more places, all of those pieces.
And now solve access to justice too.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Make sure career development is getting right, the career department is getting all of their kids placed, and that all of what we do equals jobs automatically, and not necessarily worrying about the pedagogical value of what we're doing as we do it. So we want to talk a little bit about who we are in the midst of that tension and contradiction.
So to that end, we're the resistance, right? We are the outsiders and we're often marginalized, and I think that's because of all that we've said. We make people uncomfortable, right? We make them face the reality of law as it's practiced. Often say in clinics, well, that's like how I would love to see law practiced, right? But oftentimes the realities of the pressures of law don't enable law to be practiced that way.
And this proximity to the profession, I think somebody over here mentioned that might be in a force that we didn't initially talk about. It was on my list to talk about, I kind of skipped that. Is that pressure that we have between, we are the closest to sort of the bridge between the law school and the practice. So we have pressure from alumni, give us students, send us students, etc. Pressure from career services, to these got to work with jobs, you've got to give this person, that firm, whatever. Don't even get me started on judges today. And, yeah. Don't check your email before you sit on a panel. And then all of the other pieces that we've talked about that we are those folks, we're those administrators, we're also clinical teachers and educators, we're also lawyers who are trying to model good practice and those pieces to our students. And that all comes, that's a lot. Like, we're not getting paid, and that's a lot of jobs. In one role or one position, and that's certainly a force, I think, that not only impacts how we got to where we are, but is going to help, we've got to solve that to dictate where we're going in the future.
Yeah, and I'd say that we come by it honestly. So if you look back to the models that we were talking about earlier, the practical theoretical divide and the apprenticeship model, the whole reason that part of the reason we moved away from that apprenticeship model, right, was to make law school more exclusive. To shrink the profession, right? Because there were too many states saying, come as you are, practice as you are. If you're a good moral character, come practice. And so it's an interesting concept because I think, okay, maybe we do really come by this position very honestly. And it does bring in what Sandy's point. So now I think that the model that we had in the past, pure apprenticeships, wasn't workable. I think that Mr. Columbus Langdell's model isn't workable. So I think the new model is a truly integrated model of skills and values and practice and doctrinal. And I think our law schools should be practicing law schools. I think you should be combining, like Seattle U. I don't know if Jill is here, if anyone's here, there's Monica. Yeah, they use their legal writing department, their clinicians, their externship practitioners, and they create real access to justice issues, and they integrate all of those people and work on small teams to figure out how to deliver quality legal education, giving both the substance and the practice at the same time. And I think that's the future. We need to solve this problem. We have 80-some% of people who need to be serviced and get legal services aren't getting them. Our law schools are really out of touch with the reality.
And I think one thing as we've looked at it, we're discovering is that when we do this piecemeal, even when we do great things like mandate that every student's going to leave with a full life client clinic, there's consequences to each of those things, right? And what we have been doing to some degree in legal ed is we're sort of band-aiding tiny pieces across the curriculum rather than kind of looking at the overall view, I think, as Cindy said, what is the value each of these experiences that we can bring in each year, right? How are we integrating across the board and including externships and practical ed, not as something that gets added on to the end, but as something that's valuable for different reasons in a variety of ways across the entire law school experience.
Great. All right. So that was our deeper dive. Now we're going to ask you to do a little integration yourselves.
Wow, so our hope for this session was to get that our panelists would get our wheels turning a little bit, to take full advantage of this. The wheels in my head are spinning like this, and I don't know how I'm going to get them to slow down, but thank you. So we're actually, as if our panelists haven't challenged us enough, we're going to go back in a few minutes and get more challenges for the group. But first, we want to get you take a minute, and we've distributed these blue sheets as a way to maybe help you process some of what is happening in this conference and sort of keep some notes and challenges for yourself. So at the top, we have a little note, and we're just going to give you a minute to do a quick write. Just identify one thing that you want to work on at this conference, one thing that you want to work on improving about your teaching or about your program. There's a space for maybe making notes about the challenges we're going to get at the end of this. And then we just invite you to keep these sheets with you during the conference. Make some notes, your ideas may change or evolve, and on Sunday, at the closing, we're going to invite you to get them back out again and make a few more notes. So just take a minute.
And we're just having a little improv over here. We're thinking about putting out a box and inviting you to make a copy for yourself, write it somewhere else, and we will collect them anonymously and see and report back to the community. We'll think about that a little more, but for now, just do your quick write. Nothing like
And after you've done that, we'll give you a minute if you want to turn to the person next to you and share your ideas. We have a couple minutes to do that, and then we'll go back to the panel.
We've asked each of our 5 panelists to say exactly what you see, and their challenges to us, etc. You've already heard some, etc. There is space on the sheet if you want to keep track of the one that really hits home for you, whatever you'd like. But we're starting with Cindy.
Okay, I want you to save this for a day or a week where you feel buried by administrative minutiae. And I know we all have had that, those days and weeks. And I want you to remember that you have tremendous power. You've got the power to speak truth to your deans and your faculty at your school. You have the power to speak through to the placement where you send your students. And most of all, most important, you are conveying and introducing students to the privilege of practicing law. And I've been a lawyer for a long time, and I've never lost that sense that how fortunate I am to be a lawyer and a teacher. So hold that idea of how powerful you are. And it doesn't matter what your status is, you are a teacher with power.
Great. Who's going next?
I can go. I'm going to riff off Cindy because I like the word power, and I think power is in story. And so I want to know what the power of our collective story as externship professionals are. And whenever I get lost, right, because it happens all the time, in the minutia, in the dealing with the judge who has a problem, right, I zoom out and I ask the broader question. Why are we here? Why are we doing this work? And if I orient myself around those larger scale questions, and if I model that for my students, which is ultimately what I want them to be doing, why am I in this profession? What professional aspirations do I have that I want to hold myself accountable to? Then it's always easier to deal with the problem, right? Because I can deal with the problem if I'm coming at it from a place of integrity and I feel like I'm doing this for a reason. So I can slog through the work, I can slog through the email, I can slog through the problem because I have a grander frame. And so what I'm asking is us to use the same frame that we're asking our students to use, which is the why do we do this work? What's our story? What's your story?
Great. Next.
I'll go, because I'm not going to be inspirational, so inspiration at the beginning, which is going to make it wrong. But so I just want to say, I think the most important issue that we still need to confront is the fact that we are in a profession that requires of law schools that out of a minimum of 83 credits, a minimum of 6 have to be experiential, which can be either a clinic or a field placement or a simulation course. And that is, I'm on tape, so I'm going to swear. I feel like I'm going to swear anyway. I feel like you guys are fucking
That's going in our publicity.
That's pathetic. I spoke to in the back room there. He educated me on this. No other profession is that pathetic. In terms of a supervised practice, requiring people to have a period of supervised practice before they get a license. And that's ridiculous. So I think we still, as a community, need to be calling that what it is. And what I think the biggest challenge is right now we're trying to call that in an era where bar passage rates are going down, where there are more and more students in law schools who have low indicators for passing the bar, and we're sitting there saying, well, the bar exam doesn't really test maybe the most important things that needs to be tested. So it's a very complicated situation, but it's very difficult to keep pushing for a less pathetic professional training in the face of that, like sort of what the bar exam is and what the pressures are to get our students to pass that exam.
Great.
I'm not going to go last, so
I'm
going to jump right into it. Even if I don't have anything very thoughtful.
I'm just going to pull the fire alarm to get out of here.
I think that it's important for you and us to remember our history, and to record our history, and to celebrate our history, because the history can inform the future. And it's important that this community continue to move forward in developing pedagogy, both in their individual schools, but nationally, through conferences like this and through other meetings. So I want to issue a challenge that you, especially the newer initiatives, take on that mandate and move forward.
Take us home to Laura.
Hi. So this morning I just have to say what I got out of this morning. So in the scholarship workshop this morning, what I got was, well, besides a desire to stay in that room in perpetuity because it was nice and safe and happy in there, was a really great, healthy dose of confidence. To be surrounded, the value of being surrounded by people who are going to tell you that who you are and what your voice is valuable. And that you have something to contribute, regardless of where you've been, what your status is, where you're at, what subject matter you teach, whatever else that might be, that we all bring something to the table that's worthy. And it's good to be reminded of that. And so to me, I would just leave you with the notion that we have to, absolutely have to do exactly what I experienced this morning, which is we have to be supportive of each other, and we have to demand to be included.
Well,
Wow.
Alex has a minute, he wants a minute, and I think we have.
Wait, where's the sign?
Just 1 minute. I just want to remind you, as you go forth to the 8 concurrent sessions this afternoon and the multiple ones tomorrow, Kendall Carew, Georgia State, has created a guidebook app for us. If you want to keep track on your tablet or your phone, download the guidebook app and do a search for externships, and that will get you the full schedule of the conference.
Thank you. But I want to do, yes, go ahead, Bob. No. We're done.
Ask Alex what time the next session starts.
Oh, yeah. 45. Yeah, we have. So we kept running in almost on time, and there was so much richness, but I just want to thank our panelists one more time. Officially launched. Go forth and great thoughts.